Picture this scene. You're standing on a mountaintop and the air is electric with tension. Below you, hundreds of religious leaders are screaming, jumping, cutting themselves with knives, begging their God to answer them. They've been at this for hours. Blood is everywhere. Their voices are hoarse. And then, in the middle of this chaos, one man steps forward with the most epic piece of sarcasm in human history. He looks at these frenzied religious leaders and says, with perfect comedic timing, "Maybe you should shout louder. Perhaps your God is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." This isn't a scene from a comedy show. This isn't satire. This is straight from the pages of Scripture, and it's about to become the greatest mic drop moment in biblical history. The man delivering this legendary burn? The prophet Elijah. And what happens next will not only vindicate his boldness, but literally bring fire from heaven and change an entire nation. But here's what most people miss about this story. This wasn't just ancient trash talk. This was a watershed moment in human history where truth confronted deception, where authentic power exposed religious pretense, and where one man's fearless faith sparked a spiritual revolution that still echoes today. And the lessons buried in this narrative are so relevant to our current moment that they'll make you question everything you think you know about courage, authenticity, and standing up for truth in a world full of pretenders. See, we live in an age of spiritual counterfeits. Every day we're bombarded with false promises, fake gurus, and religious performances that look impressive on the surface but lack any real power underneath. We have influencers selling enlightenment, politicians promising salvation, and movements claiming to have the answers while delivering nothing but empty spectacle. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Elijah was facing 3,000 years ago on Mount Carmel. But before we dive into that epic showdown, we need to understand who Elijah was and why this moment mattered so much. Because this story isn't just about ancient history. It's about what happens when someone with genuine authority confronts a system built on lies. It's about the moment when authentic power meets religious performance. And it's about why sometimes the most loving thing you can do is publicly expose deception with a well-timed piece of holy sarcasm. Elijah wasn't your typical prophet. This guy appeared on the scene like a force of nature. The first time we meet him in Scripture, he's walking into the palace of the most powerful king in the region and declaring a drought that would last for years. No introduction, no credentials, no political maneuvering. Just pure, unfiltered, prophetic authority, declaring that the heavens would be shut until further notice. Imagine having that level of confidence in your calling. But here's the thing about Elijah that made him so dangerous to the religious establishment of his day. He wasn't interested in playing their games. He wasn't looking for their approval. He wasn't trying to climb their hierarchical ladder or get invited to their conferences. Elijah had a direct line to the source of all power, and he knew it. And that kind of authentic authority always threatens systems built on performance and pretense. The world Elijah lived in was ruled by a king named Ahab, who had married a foreign princess named Jezebel. Now, Jezebel wasn't just any princess. She was a zealot for the worship of Baal, a fertility god whose religion promised prosperity, good harvests, and material blessing in exchange for elaborate rituals and sacrifices. Sound like anything you've heard before? Because the prosperity gospel has ancient roots, and what Elijah was confronting wasn't just idolatry. It was an entire religious system that promised people they could manipulate divine power through the right techniques, the right words, the right rituals. Jezebel had imported hundreds of prophets of Baal into Israel, And these weren't just religious officials. These were the influencers of their day. They had massive followings. They put on spectacular shows. They claimed to have inside access to divine power. They promised their followers that if they just followed the right formulas, performed the right rituals, and supported their ministry financially, they would unlock the secrets of prosperity and blessing. And it was working. The people were buying it. The king was endorsing it. The culture was shifting toward this new, exciting form of spirituality that promised everything and demanded nothing but external compliance. Traditional faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was starting to look boring by comparison. Old-fashioned, outdated. Why worship a God who demands heart transformation when you can worship gods who promise material prosperity in exchange for religious performance? But here's what the people didn't understand. They were being sold a counterfeit. Baal worship looked impressive on the surface, but it had no real power underneath. It was all show, no substance, all performance, no presence, all promises, no delivery. And Elijah knew it. He could see through the religious theater to the empty stage behind the curtain. And after years of watching his people be deceived by spiritual snake oil salesmen, he'd had enough. So Elijah issued a challenge that would expose the truth once and for all. He told King Ahab to gather all the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, plus the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table, and meet him on Mount Carmel for a showdown. Winner takes all. The losing religion would be exposed as powerless, and the winning God would be acknowledged as the true source of divine authority. Now, from a purely strategic standpoint, this seems insane. Elijah is one man challenging 850 religious professionals to a public contest. These aren't just any religious leaders. These are the elite, the cream of the crop, the ones with the biggest platforms, the most followers, the most impressive credentials, and the backing of the royal family. Elijah doesn't even have a team. He doesn't have an organization. He doesn't have a marketing budget or a social media strategy. It's literally one man with a message against an entire religious industrial complex. But here's what Elijah understood that most people miss. When you have genuine authority, numbers don't matter. When you're connected to the real source of power, platforms become irrelevant. When you're operating in authentic truth, you don't need to play the game by the rules of religious performance. You can simply speak truth and let the chips fall where they may. The challenge was simple. Both sides would prepare a sacrifice, but neither would light the fire. Instead, they would call on their respective gods to send fire from heaven to consume the offering. Whichever god answered with fire would be acknowledged as the true God. It was elegant in its simplicity. No room for interpretation, no ambiguity, no religious debate or theological hair-splitting. Just pure, demonstrable power. The prophets of Baal went first. 850 trained professionals with a home field advantage and royal backing. They prepared their sacrifice, and then they began their ritual. And this is where things get really interesting, because what happened next reveals everything about the difference between religious performance and authentic spiritual authority. These prophets didn't just pray quietly. They put on a show. They danced around the altar. They chanted. They worked themselves into a frenzy. They called on Baal with increasing desperation and volume. From morning until noon, they performed their religious ritual with all the energy and enthusiasm they could muster, and nothing happened. No fire, no sign, no response. Just silence from heaven. Now here's where most people would have given up. Here's where most religious systems would have made excuses. They might have said the timing wasn't right, or that God works in mysterious ways, or that the people didn't have enough faith, or that there was unconfessed sin in the camp. They would have spiritualized the failure and found a way to save face. But these prophets were committed to their performance. They were all in on the show, so they kept going. They shouted louder. They danced harder. They worked themselves into an even greater frenzy, and still nothing happened. The heavens remained silent. Their God remained absent. Their religious performance, no matter how sincere or intense, produced absolutely no results. And that's when Elijah stepped forward with one of the most savage moments of holy sarcasm in human history. Looking at these 850 sweating, desperate religious performers, he said, "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Now let's pause here because this moment is absolutely loaded with meaning. Elijah isn't just being sarcastic. He's making a theological point that cuts to the very heart of what authentic spirituality looks like versus religious performance. He's essentially saying, if your God is real, why does he need you to wake him up? If your God is powerful, why is he too busy to respond? If your God is present, why is he traveling? This wasn't just ancient trolling. This was prophetic exposure. Elijah was using humor to reveal the absurdity of worshiping gods who are less attentive, less present, and less powerful than even human beings. He was pointing out that their entire religious system was based on the premise that divine power could be manipulated through human performance, and that if they just tried hard enough, shouted loud enough, or performed enthusiastically enough, they could force their God to respond. But here's the beautiful irony. While Elijah was mocking their God for possibly being asleep, the God of Israel never sleeps nor slumbers. While he was joking about their God being too busy to respond, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is never too busy for his people. While he was suggesting their God might be traveling, the true God is omnipresent and never absent from those who call on him. The sarcasm wasn't cruel, it was revelatory. Elijah was using humor to expose the fundamental difference between a religion based on human performance and a relationship based on divine grace. He was showing the people that they had been trying to earn from counterfeits what God freely gives to those who trust in him. And the prophets of Baal, they took the bait. Instead of recognizing the absurdity of their situation, they doubled down, they shouted louder. They cut themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. They prophesied frantically. They performed with increasing desperation. From noon until evening, they continued their religious theater, becoming more and more extreme in their attempts to provoke a response from their silent God. Think about this for a moment. These were highly trained religious professionals. These were people who had dedicated their lives to their spiritual practice. These were the experts, the authorities, the ones with the impressive credentials and the large followings. And yet, when put to the test, when asked to demonstrate the reality of their spiritual claims, they had nothing. All their training, all their experience, all their religious knowledge, and they couldn't produce even a spark of authentic spiritual power. This is the uncomfortable truth that every religious system eventually has to face. You can have all the right techniques, all the right words, all the right rituals, all the right credentials, and still be completely disconnected from any real spiritual authority. You can be sincere and enthusiastic and committed and still be sincerely wrong. You can put on an impressive show and still have nothing of substance underneath. And this is where Elijah's story becomes so relevant to our current moment. We live in an age of spiritual performance. We have religious leaders who are more concerned with their brand than their character. We have movements that prioritize style over substance. We have spiritual influencers who promise profound transformation while displaying no evidence of it in their own lives. We have religious systems that generate a lot of heat but very little light. Just like the prophets of Baal, many modern spiritual leaders have mastered the art of religious performance. They know how to work a crowd. They understand the psychology of persuasion. They can create emotional experiences that feel spiritual. They can use techniques and methodologies that produce predictable responses. But when you strip away the show, when you look past the performance, when you test their claims against reality, you often find the same result as those ancient prophets. A lot of noise, but no fire from heaven. But then Elijah stepped up to demonstrate what authentic spiritual authority actually looks like. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because everything Elijah did was the exact opposite of what the prophets of Baal had been doing. While they had performed with increasing intensity, Elijah moved with calm confidence. While they had tried to manipulate divine power through religious technique, Elijah simply trusted in relationship. While they had shouted and danced and cut themselves to get their God's attention, Elijah approached his God with the quiet assurance of someone who knew he was already heard. But here's the most remarkable part. Instead of making his task easier, Elijah made it harder. He didn't just prepare his sacrifice and call on God. He created conditions that would make divine intervention even more obvious and undeniable. He dug a trench around the altar. He arranged the wood and the sacrifice. And then he did something that seemed completely counterproductive from a human perspective. He doused the entire altar with water. Not once, not twice, 12 times. He soaked the wood, the sacrifice, and filled the trench with water until everything was completely saturated. Why would he do this? Because Elijah understood something that escapes most people. When you're operating in authentic spiritual authority, you don't need to stack the deck in your favor. You don't need to create favorable conditions or manipulate circumstances to make God look good. In fact, the more impossible the situation, the more clearly God's power is demonstrated when He shows up. This is the confidence that comes from genuine relationship versus religious performance. Elijah wasn't trying to help God out. He wasn't worried about making God look bad if nothing happened. He wasn't hedging his bets or creating backup plans. He was so confident in God's character and power that he deliberately created conditions that would make it impossible for anyone to attribute the results to natural causes or human manipulation. And then, after making his task as difficult as possible, Elijah prayed. But notice how different his prayer was from the hours of frantic religious performance they had just witnessed. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't dance. He didn't work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals or use repetitive formulas. Instead, he simply spoke to God as someone who knew he was heard. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. That's it. No manipulation. No religious performance, no attempt to twist God's arm or earn His favor. Just a simple, confident request from someone who understood his identity, his authority, and his relationship with the source of all power. Elijah didn't pray like someone trying to convince God to do something. He prayed like someone who already knew God's heart and was simply asking Him to reveal it publicly. And here's what happened next. The fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and licked up the water in the trench. Not just a little flame, not just enough fire to consume the sacrifice, supernatural fire that consumed everything, including the stones and the soil, and evaporated all the water that Elijah had poured out. The response was immediate, undeniable, overwhelming. In a moment, everyone watching understood the difference between religious performance and authentic spiritual power. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. 850 religious professionals spending hours in frantic religious activity with no results, followed by one man offering a simple prayer and receiving an immediate supernatural response. When the people saw it, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement. This was a heart-level recognition of authentic authority. They had witnessed the difference between powerless religion and powerful relationship. They had seen the contrast between human performance and divine presence, and they responded with worship, surrender, and declaration of truth. But here's what makes this story so much more than just an ancient tale of religious competition. This showdown on Mount Carmel reveals principles about spiritual authority, authentic leadership, and standing for truth that are desperately needed in our current cultural moment. First, Elijah's story teaches us that authentic spiritual authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. In a world full of noise, where everyone is competing for attention and trying to outperform each other, genuine authority operates with quiet confidence. It doesn't need to manufacture drama or create controversy to prove its legitimacy. It simply speaks truth and trusts that truth has its own power to convince and convict. Look at how our current culture rewards religious performance. The loudest voices get the biggest platforms. The most dramatic presentations attract the largest audiences. The most sensational claims generate the most engagement. We live in a time when spiritual authority is often measured by metrics that have nothing to do with actual spiritual maturity or divine connection. Followers, engagement rates, book sales, conference attendance, media appearances. But Elijah's example challenges all of that. He didn't need a platform to have authority. He didn't need an audience to validate his calling. He didn't need external recognition to confirm his relationship with God. His authority came from his connection to the source of all authority, and that gave him the confidence to stand alone against an entire religious system if necessary. Second, this story reveals that authentic power doesn't need to be protected or promoted through human effort. The prophets of Baal spent hours trying to manipulate their god into responding. They used every technique they knew. They employed every religious method at their disposal. They worked themselves into physical and emotional exhaustion, trying to produce spiritual results through human performance. But Elijah didn't try to help God look good. He didn't worry about managing God's reputation or protecting his image. In fact, he deliberately created conditions that would make divine intervention more difficult, not easier. Because when you're connected to genuine power, you don't need to manufacture results or manipulate circumstances. You can simply create space for truth to be revealed and trust that authentic power will demonstrate itself. This has profound implications for how we approach leadership, ministry, and influence in our current context. How much of our energy goes into trying to make ourselves look good rather than creating space for God to reveal Himself? How often do we stack the deck in our favor rather than trusting that truth has its own power to convince? How frequently do we rely on human techniques and methods rather than divine authority and presence? Third, Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal demonstrates that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is publicly expose deception. Notice that Elijah didn't try to find common ground with the prophets of Baal. He didn't look for ways to affirm their sincerity while gently correcting their theology. He didn't attempt to create unity by downplaying their differences. Instead, he created a public showdown that would expose the emptiness of their religious system once and for all. This might seem harsh by today's standards, where tolerance and acceptance are often valued above truth and clarity. We live in a culture that prioritizes feelings over facts, where challenging someone's beliefs is often seen as judgmental or unloving. We're told that the most important thing is sincerity, not accuracy. That as long as someone is genuine in their beliefs, we shouldn't question or confront them. But Elijah understood something that we often forget. False religion isn't just intellectually wrong, it's spiritually dangerous. It doesn't just lead people away from truth, it leads them away from the source of life itself. The prophets of Baal weren't just teaching incorrect theology, they were offering people counterfeit hope, fake promises, and empty rituals that would never deliver what they claimed. And when you understand the stakes involved, when you realize that people's eternal destiny and present well-being are hanging in the balance, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is expose the lie so clearly and publicly that no one can continue to be deceived by it. This is why Elijah's sarcasm wasn't cruel. It was merciful. He was using humor to reveal the absurdity of trusting in powerless gods so that people could turn to the God who actually has the power to save, heal, deliver, and transform. He was exposing the emptiness of religious performance so that people could discover the fullness of authentic relationship. Fourth, this story shows us that authentic spiritual authority is always demonstrated through results, not just rhetoric. The prophets of Baal had impressive credentials, large followings, royal endorsement, and centuries of religious tradition behind them. They could talk a good game. They knew all the right words, all the right techniques, all the right methods. But when it came time to demonstrate the reality of their spiritual claims, they had nothing to show for it. Elijah, on the other hand, didn't need to prove his credentials or defend his methodology. He didn't need to explain his theological framework or justify his approach. He simply created a situation where authentic spiritual power could be demonstrated, and then he got out of the way and let God be God. This challenges us to examine our own spiritual lives and leadership. How much of our authority is based on position versus demonstration? How often do we rely on titles, degrees, experience, or reputation rather than actual spiritual results? How frequently do we use religious language to mask the absence of spiritual power? The uncomfortable truth is that you can have all the right credentials and still be spiritually impotent. You can know all the right words and still lack authentic authority. You can master all the right techniques and still be disconnected from the source of genuine power. And eventually, if you're in a position of spiritual leadership, you'll be put in a situation where your claims will be tested against reality and the truth will be revealed. But here's the beautiful thing about Elijah's story. It doesn't just expose what false spiritual authority looks like. It reveals what authentic authority actually is and how it operates. And understanding these principles can transform not just how we lead, but how we live. Authentic spiritual authority begins with intimate relationship, not religious performance. Elijah's power didn't come from his ability to work a crowd, or manipulate emotions, or employ persuasive techniques. It came from his personal, intimate connection with the living God. He knew God's character. He understood God's heart. He was confident in God's promises. And that relationship gave him access to divine power that no amount of religious training or experience could provide. This is revolutionary in a culture that often treats spirituality like a skill to be developed rather than a relationship to be cultivated. We have people who can teach you how to pray more effectively, how to read the Bible more systematically, how to worship more enthusiastically, how to evangelize more persuasively. And while those skills have their place, they're worthless if they're not flowing out of genuine intimacy with God. Elijah didn't need to learn techniques for getting God's attention because he already had God's attention. He didn't need methods for earning God's favor because he already lived in God's favor. He didn't need formulas for accessing God's power because he already walked in relationship with the source of all power. Authentic spiritual authority also operates with complete dependence on God rather than confidence in human ability. Notice that Elijah didn't try to share the credit for what happened on Mount Carmel. He didn't present himself as a partner with God in performing the miracle. He didn't claim to have special abilities or unique gifts that made the supernatural intervention possible. Instead, he made it clear that he was simply God's servant, acting in obedience to God's command and trusting in God's power to accomplish what only God could do. This is radically different from much of what passes for spiritual leadership today. We live in an age of celebrity pastors, superstar evangelists, and spiritual influencers who build their brands around their unique gifts, special insights, or powerful presence. People follow them because of their charisma, their communication skills, their ability to perform, or their track record of success. But Elijah's example challenges all of that. True spiritual authority deflects attention from the messenger to the message, from the servant to the master, from human ability to divine power. It doesn't seek to build a following around a personality. It seeks to point people to the person of Jesus Christ. Authentic spiritual authority is also characterized by moral courage rather than people-pleasing compromise. Elijah didn't conduct a poll before challenging the prophets of Baal. He didn't check with focus groups to see if his message would be well received. He didn't modify his approach based on what would be most acceptable to the largest number of people. Instead, he spoke truth regardless of the personal cost, stood for what was right regardless of popular opinion, and trusted God with the results. This kind of moral courage is desperately needed in our current cultural moment. We live in a time when truth is often sacrificed on the altar of tolerance, when clarity is abandoned in favor of cultural acceptability, when leaders modify their message based on what will generate the least controversy, rather than what will produce the most transformation. But Elijah's example reminds us that authentic spiritual authority sometimes requires us to stand alone, to speak unpopular truths, to challenge accepted norms, and to trust that God will vindicate righteousness even when it's costly in the short term. Real leaders don't follow the crowd. They follow the truth and trust others to follow them. Finally, authentic spiritual authority is always focused on God's glory rather than personal recognition. From the beginning to the end of this story, Elijah made it clear that this wasn't about proving his power, or building his reputation, or advancing his ministry. It was about demonstrating God's reality, revealing God's character, and turning people's hearts back to their Creator. When the fire fell and the people acknowledged that the Lord is God, Elijah didn't take a victory lap. He didn't use the moment to promote himself or build his platform. Instead, he immediately turned the focus back to God and called the people to decisive action that would align their lives with the truth they had just witnessed. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of Elijah's example for those of us in leadership today. It's natural to want recognition for our efforts, appreciation for our sacrifices, and credit for our contributions. It's human to hope that our faithful service will be noticed, acknowledged, and rewarded. And there's nothing wrong with receiving honor when it's offered. But authentic spiritual authority is always willing to decrease so that God can increase. It's always ready to step into the background so that God can take center stage. It's always focused on advancing God's kingdom rather than building personal empires. Now, here's where this ancient story connects to the viral moment we're living in today. Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal wasn't just a historical event. It was a prototype for how truth confronts deception in every generation. And the principles that govern that showdown are just as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. We live in an age of spiritual counterfeits that would make the prophets of Baal jealous. We have religious movements that promise prosperity without transformation, blessing without obedience, power without character. We have spiritual leaders who prioritize performance over presence, style over substance, entertainment over transformation. We have entire systems built around generating emotional experiences that feel spiritual but produce no lasting change in people's lives. Just like in Elijah's day, these counterfeit spiritualities often look more impressive than authentic faith. They have bigger budgets, larger audiences, more sophisticated presentations, and better marketing. They promise quick results, easy solutions, and painless transformation. They appeal to our desire for blessing without sacrifice, power without submission, spiritual experience without moral transformation. And just like in Elijah's day, many people are being deceived by the impressive packaging and missing the empty contents underneath. They're following leaders who can put on a great show but have no real connection to divine power. They're participating in religious activities that generate a lot of heat but produce no spiritual light. They're pursuing spiritual experiences that make them feel good in the moment but leave them unchanged in the long term. But Elijah's example gives us hope. It shows us that authentic spiritual authority doesn't need to compete with counterfeit religion on its own terms. It doesn't need bigger budgets, slicker presentations, or more sophisticated marketing. It simply needs to create opportunities for truth to be demonstrated, and then trust that reality has its own power to convince. This is why we need more leaders like Elijah in our generation. Not people who are looking for platforms or building brands or promoting themselves, but people who are so connected to the source of authentic power that they can speak truth with confidence, stand alone when necessary, and trust God to vindicate righteousness regardless of the personal cost. We need leaders who aren't afraid to use holy sarcasm to expose spiritual pretense, who aren't intimidated by impressive credentials or large followings when those credentials and followings aren't backed by authentic spiritual authority, who are willing to create public moments where truth can be demonstrated and counterfeit spirituality can be exposed for what it really is. We need leaders who understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is publicly confront deception so that people can be freed from spiritual bondage and turned toward truth. Who recognize that tolerance of error isn't kindness to those who are being deceived by it. Who are willing to risk being labeled as divisive, judgmental, or unloving in order to rescue people from lies that are destroying their lives. But we also need to understand that this kind of leadership comes at a cost. Elijah didn't just walk away from Mount Carmel and live happily ever after. The victory he experienced there was followed by some of the darkest moments of his ministry. Jezebel threatened his life. He fled into the wilderness. He experienced depression and wanted to die. He struggled with loneliness and felt like he was the only one left who was standing for truth. This is the reality of authentic spiritual leadership. It's not just about the mountaintop moments of victory and vindication. It's also about the valley experiences of opposition and isolation. It's about continuing to trust God when the immediate results of your obedience are persecution rather than praise, rejection rather than recognition, suffering rather than success. But here's what Elijah discovered in that wilderness experience and what every authentic leader eventually learns. God doesn't just call us to public confrontations with deception. He also sustains us through private struggles with discouragement. He doesn't just give us authority to challenge counterfeit spirituality. He also provides comfort when that challenge costs us more than we expected. And ultimately, He doesn't just use us to expose what's false. He uses us to reveal what's true, to demonstrate what authentic relationship with Him actually looks like, to show a watching world that there's a difference between religious performance and spiritual reality, to prove that the God we serve is not sleeping, not traveling, not too busy to respond to those who call on Him in truth. This is the call on your life if you're willing to accept it. Not necessarily to be another Elijah, standing alone on a mountaintop challenging hundreds of false prophets, but to be someone who understands the difference between authentic spiritual authority and religious performance. Someone who is so connected to the source of real power that you can speak truth with confidence and trust God with the results. Maybe your Mount Carmel is a workplace where you're surrounded by people who have impressive titles but lack authentic character. Maybe it's a social circle where spiritual conversations happen, but spiritual transformation is absent. Maybe it's a religious environment where the focus has shifted from God's glory to human performance. Maybe it's a family situation where everyone talks about faith, but no one demonstrates its power. Whatever your context, you have the opportunity to be a person who represents authentic spiritual authority in a world full of counterfeits. Not through arrogance or condescension or superiority, but through quiet confidence in the reality of your relationship with God. Not through religious performance or spiritual showmanship, but through the kind of character and integrity that can only come from genuine intimacy with the divine. You have the opportunity to be someone who isn't afraid to challenge deception when you encounter it, who isn't intimidated by impressive credentials that aren't backed by authentic authority, who is willing to speak truth even when it's unpopular, stand for righteousness even when it's costly, and trust God to vindicate what's right even when the immediate results are discouraging. But most importantly, you have the opportunity to be someone who creates space for God to demonstrate His reality in your life and through your leadership. Someone who doesn't try to help God look good, but simply lives in such intimate relationship with Him that His presence and power are undeniable to those around you. The world is full of people who are tired of religious performance and hungry for spiritual reality. They're tired of leaders who can talk a good game but have no authentic power to back up their claims. They're tired of spiritual experiences that generate a lot of emotion but produce no lasting transformation. They're tired of being promised fire from heaven and getting nothing but smoke and mirrors. But when they encounter someone who has genuine spiritual authority, someone who operates out of authentic relationship rather than religious technique, someone who demonstrates the reality of God's power through the transformation of their own character and the fruit of their ministry, they recognize it immediately. They fall on their faces and declare, "The Lord, He is God." This is what the world needs from us. Not more religious performance, but authentic spiritual authority. Not better techniques for manipulating emotions, but deeper intimacy with the source of all power. Not more impressive presentations, but more genuine transformation. Not bigger platforms, but clearer demonstrations of God's reality. And here's the beautiful truth that Elijah's story reveals. When authentic spiritual authority confronts counterfeit religion, when genuine power encounters empty performance, when truth challenges deception, there's really no contest. The fire of God's presence doesn't just barely edge out human effort. It completely overwhelms it. It consumes not just the sacrifice, but the altar, the stones, the soil, and all the water poured around it. This is what happens when the real God shows up. Not just enough power to get by, but overwhelming demonstration of divine authority that leaves no room for doubt, no space for argument, no opportunity for explanation other than the obvious reality that the Lord, He, is God. So the question isn't whether you have what it takes to be like Elijah. The question is whether you're willing to step into the authentic relationship with God that will give you access to the same spiritual authority that He demonstrated. Whether you're willing to prioritize intimacy with God over religious performance. Whether you're willing to trust in divine power rather than human technique. Whether you're willing to stand for truth even when it costs you popularity, recognition, or acceptance. Because here's what I can promise you. In a world full of spiritual counterfeits, authentic spiritual authority will always stand out. In a culture dominated by religious performance, genuine relationship with God will always be compelling. In an age of empty promises and powerless religion, the demonstration of real spiritual power will always capture attention and change lives. The prophets of Baal are still with us. They look different now. They use different methods. They make different claims. But they're still offering people the same counterfeit spirituality that promises everything and delivers nothing. They're still trying to manipulate divine power through human performance. They're still putting on impressive shows that generate a lot of heat, but produce no heavenly fire. And the world is still waiting for someone to step forward with the kind of holy boldness that Elijah demonstrated. Someone who isn't afraid to call out spiritual pretense with sanctified sarcasm. Someone who is willing to create public moments where truth can be tested and demonstrated. Someone who has such confidence in the reality of their relationship with God that they're willing to stake everything on His faithfulness. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe your moment to step forward is right now. Maybe the platform you've been given, the influence you've been granted, the relationships you've been entrusted with are all preparation for your own Mount Carmel moment, when you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate the difference between religious performance and authentic spiritual authority. If so, remember Elijah's example. Don't try to compete with counterfeit spirituality on its own terms. Don't attempt to outperform the performers or outshow the showman. Instead, create conditions where authentic power can be demonstrated, and then trust God to show up in ways that will leave no doubt about who the real God is. Remember that authentic spiritual authority comes through intimate relationship, operates with complete dependence on God, requires moral courage, and focuses on God's glory rather than personal recognition. Remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is publicly expose deception so that people can be freed to pursue truth. And remember that when the fire of God's presence falls, when authentic spiritual power is demonstrated, when truth is revealed in all its compelling beauty and undeniable reality, people don't just admire it or appreciate it or applaud it. They fall on their faces and declare, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" That's the response we're looking for. That's the result we're trusting God to produce. That's the reason we're willing to risk everything to represent authentic spiritual authority in a world full of counterfeits. Because when people encounter the real God through real people who have real relationships with Him, everything changes. Hearts are transformed. Lives are redirected. Eternities are altered. This is your invitation to step into that kind of authentic spiritual authority, to become the kind of person who creates space for God to demonstrate His reality, to develop the kind of relationship with Him that gives you access to power that religious performance could never provide, to live with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're connected to the source of all authority, all power, all truth. The world is waiting. The stage is set. The moment is here. The only question is whether you're ready to step forward and represent the God who never sleeps, never travels, and is never too busy to respond to those who call on him in truth. The God whose fire still falls, whose power still transforms, whose authority still stands supreme over every counterfeit, every pretender, every empty promise of powerless religion. Your Mount Carmel moment is coming. When it arrives, will you be ready to pray with the quiet confidence of someone who knows they're heard? Will you be prepared to trust in the power of authentic relationship rather than the techniques of religious performance? Will you have the courage to create conditions where truth can be demonstrated and then trust God to vindicate his own character and authority? Because when you do, when you step into authentic spiritual authority and create space for the real God to show up, the fire will fall. Not just enough to meet the need, but enough to overwhelm every doubt, silence every critic, and compel every witness to acknowledge that the Lord, he is God. That's the mic drop moment the world is waiting for. That's the viral video that changes everything. That's the demonstration of authentic power that exposes every counterfeit and points every heart toward truth. And that's the calling on your life, if you're willing to accept it, embrace it, and live it out with the same holy boldness that Elijah demonstrated on Mount Carmel 3,000 years ago. The fire is still falling. The question is whether you're ready to call it down.